Welcome, everyone, to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Friday evening, joined by a good friend of mine and also esteemed theologian and scholar, Dr. Matthew Meinert. How are you, Dr. Meinert?
I'm well. Obviously, I'm a philosopher who has to play the role of a theologian. You know, I want to be honest. So,
if we're going to be honest, I think that you generally know more about theology than most people with theology.
Well, translating, maybe that'll be a good way for me to talk about my translating work, because translating has been, on top of other. I mean, I do have some formal stuff in theology, and you can't do middle age stuff without swinging a cat through theology, right? My translating work has been like, sitting at the feet of the theological masters of the 20th century, but with pipeline and that stuff. But tonight I'm not doctor. I'm not in professorial mode, so I got laid down stuff.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. And just
and a
for
beer.
everybody,
Don't be scandalized. It's just
and
a Friday.
beer. That'll work. If I had a beer, I'd be drinking one. For now, I just have coffee. So
coffee, nice and hot coffee.
It was either coffee or sweet tea. That's how we do it here in the South. Yeah. Sweet tea.
Oh,
I always forget y'all up north. Y'all don't really do sweet tea. So whenever I go up north and I ask, we're at a restaurant or something, I order sweet tea. We don't have that, but we can add sugar to it.
We can have
it's not the same. It's not the same.
Well, if you
don't insult me with that.
I don't know what your coffee's like, but go up to the Northeast. It'll be like the time I was at a Maritime Association conference, and I asked at Dunkin' Donuts for regular coffee, and we don't have a ton of Dunkin' Donuts around here. And I walk away, and 100 feet away, I taste it, and I come back. I'm like, I said regular, and they looked at me, because I like black coffee. So go up there, get your sweet Dunkin' Donuts coffee. I don't.
Well, another thing up north is I recall y'all putting milk in your tea. That really threw me off.
Well, people do that. I mean, like milk or cream in tea. When I experienced that in England, just surprised me. Like when I do my lectures normally, because you can't have a beer when you're having a lecture, right? I usually have tea, but I have lapsang souchong tea, which is it's really smoky tea. And of course, I'm no Orientalist, as I say. So maybe I've mispronounced it. But at any rate, I guess you'd put milk in that because it's so smoky. I don't know. Or I couldn't imagine putting milk in tea, but I know that you can't. It's weird to me. Hot tea should taste by itself. But I used to not put butter on bread as a kid, not because I dislike butter, but because I like bread that much. And, I feel like you should appreciate the bread for its own texture. But I've realized that bread things accent each other. So I've grown.
You've adapted to it.
I've grown. I've developed. How appropriate this era of endless dogmatic development. I'm developing in my taste. So
aren't we all?
All right. Well, people are like banter. Next thing you know, that we're going to talk.
We could go on that topic for days. I can tell you about some odd experiences that I had in Israel. So we could go.
Yeah, you beat me there. I mean, Appalachia's odd, but I mean, you've got 3,000, 4,000 miles in a Semitic culture difference, right? Slavic culture going so much. We're poor in comparison. We've got pierogies and we've got halupki, and like that's it. So like we end there. Like
I don't even know what that is.
Go, you Southern. I mean, it's like
I gotta learn all this stuff. That's why I'm usually a fish. I'm like a fish out of water in most places. But anyways, what we're discussing today is the order of things. This was actually written by Father Garrigou-Lagrange, and it's by the way subtitled "The Realism of the Principle of Finality." I'm going to put a link to it in the description so y'all can purchase a copy. But now this is translated by Dr. Meinert. So again, if y'all want to look it up on Amazon.com right now, you can type that in and it will come up and you can order a copy. Dr. Meinert, I want to ask you a couple preliminary questions before we dive into the book itself. First of all, I know you've talked about them before on the show, but for those who are new to this, maybe seeing this first time, never heard of Father Garrigou-Lagrange, who exactly was he?
Yeah, and I'll just give short version.
Sure.
Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange was a Dominican professor at the Angelicum. He taught there from, I think, 1909 to 1960. Taught for a couple years before that in his studium, his provincial studium. Taught during that period, in addition to like the normal cursus of theology, they would do sort of a walking through the Summa. It seems like people would split up those duties, and his commentaries on the different sections of the Summa came out of that. He also was a professor of metaphysics and of all things spiritual theology. He heard the lectures of Father Juan Arentero his first year that he was there at the Ange, and it actually set up all the work he did on divinization and theosis that eventually got codified in the 3 ages of the spiritual life, which some people probably know is a 2-volume text. But it was after a couple of other texts where he was in the midst of it was whenever John of the Cross became a doctor. I think he was involved in that commission. So there was a real attempt among Thomists, some would say, to be a little bit syncretic and combine the Theresian and San Juanist spirituality with metaphysical and theological principles of Thomism, but also too, I mean, to try to build out the apophatic character of the gifts of the Holy Spirit using some of the resources available in Carmelite spirituality. He wrote like a lot of that book that was written as articles. So it's funny, if you go through his bibliography, it looks like there are all these articles that were never, published or anything, but he was writing the chapters as he went along. And he used to be able to fill up the big hall at the Angelicum.
I heard of that.
There's a video. If you look up video of I think Bishop Barron getting a degree, I think is that hall. So if you look up like Bishop Barron degree, Angelicum, that big hall, Garrigou used to fill up.
So was that much of an interest in him?
Yeah, that they say he was a great lecturer in any of those subjects too, not just spirituality. But I mean, the spirituality, he'd get more outsiders coming as well, priests who were just living in the Vatican, and even lay people. But it is said on attestation from over the years that he was quite a lecturer. He's known very well for his early work against modernism, although in the spirituality stuff, but he has all these other theological works on, just going through the Summa, on providence and predestination, on Mariology, on the theology of the priesthood, at least from a pretty Western perspective, of course. And then his interactions at the end of his career in the 40s against in the midst of the Nouvelle Theologie crisis that we've been discussing in the other lecture. So people think of him because of that last intervention as being an old curmudgeon, but he was apparently just quite a stentorian lecturer. As I've mentioned, I can't remember where on my Garrigou stump I've mentioned this, actually, if I did here ever or not, that they say he could actually get lost as he's reciting in Latin. He's lecturing in Latin because that's what you're going to do at the Roman universities at that time. And he'd get into some topic in metaphysics or in theology, and he'd start slipping into French because he'd be so excited and so into it. The accounts of Austin Woodbury, from what I hear, who was one of his students who taught then and had an institute down in Sydney, Australia, they say he was a bit of what do you call it? He wasn't a full autistic savant, but he was probably on the spectrum a bit, just had that kind of autistic touch to his mind. So a very kind of synthetic approach to Thomism. But they said his lecturing was just electric, and it was Garrigou that he picked it up. So that's kind of a long way to talk about Father Garrigou. He's influential on all those Dominicans who went through the Angelicum. He was very central to discussions up to the 30s, especially. Some of the changes in theological methodology and the issues around World War II changed his stature a little bit. The rise of the Communio school after Vatican II sort of squashed his existence, to be honest. And so there was a period where his stuff didn't exist at all, and you couldn't talk about him in polite company. But there's been a kind of Garrigou renaissance. One of the people who did an endorsement for Sens Commune, which I translated by him as well. It's coming out in May. Books take forever. I thought March, but May. I got the schedule today. It's layout. But he said, it was an archbishop wrote it. He said, it's felicitous that there's this Garrigou renewal going on now. It is unthinkable. 20 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. 10 years ago, when I started graduate school, I still had the bias that he was some old manualist who was, boring, tedious, and filled with syllogisms. And he's not. He's really not. He De Revelazione, which is coming out hopefully in December. We're trying to plan it for December. Lots of copy editing, is his manual. But it reads more like a book and not a textbooky manual, even though it is more of a textbook, how it's broken out. But then I started working with him, partially in my translating. I mean, I got to know him through Maritain, but I decided just to translate The Sense of Mystery, actually, because I was bored in graduate school because I was waiting for emails to be answered by my director.
Well, you did your dissertation on some an aspect of Maritain. Is that not right?
Well, I did my licentiate was related to Maritain.
That's right.
Natural law. Yeah, no, my dissertation was the tedium of Hervaeus Natalis' second intentions in the subject of logic. That'll put people to sleep. So,
what?
I was teaching second intentions today, but
now what was it? You said it was pretty much the Communio school that kind of marginalized him. And
well, that's unfair. Thank you for catching that. I'm thinking in terms of among faithful Catholics. Okay. I mean, the unfaithful people totally would have just written him up. The spirit of the council types, right? Yeah. So what was unfortunate was, and I appreciate that clarification, that it was, I mean, the bad blood after the Nouvelle Theologie crisis also included them in the marginalization. But Maritain got marginalized too, because Maritain was not doing a kind of historical Thomism, so it didn't fit in. Because he was actually, it's strange. People think of him for his more progressive politics, but the rest of his Thomism was so conservative that that's why he wasn't liked. So,
yeah. Now, as you noted, this is a translation. How did you, just curious side note, how did you get into translating works? What really got you interested in it?
It's an accident. It really is. I had enough facility in the languages, especially Latin and French, just given my research work in graduate school. And so when I finished my coursework at CUA, I had done all of my exams. So like there's the 3 years of courses and that stuff. I did all that stuff, got my dissertation topic approved, basically pick something that's obscure and you can, just run with it. And so I moved up here to Western PA because I had met my wife and I felt providentially that I was meant to marry the woman. And so I moved up here to a house that I had actually just, it floated around in our family for me that I was to inherit, but my relative and I were trying to figure out what to do. And I just thought, well, Lord, I'm going to go ahead and jump on this, even though it's in Western PA and I don't know what this is going to mean. Work-wise, right? I didn't really have at first any work, and at the last minute, I got some adjuncting work I did while I was writing my dissertation. So I'm up here, and I wrote the dissertation the first year. While she's still living, about an hour away from where we live now. And so when we get married, I have finished the dissertation up and have sent off everything to my director, and he just a wee bit slow getting back is all I'll say, because it'll be my luck that Timothy will watch this. The email answering was not his strongest suit. Tim Noon's he's a good man, a huge heart. Even though he's a Scotist, I love him. And he's a very good medievalist. I mean, he's a very, very good medievalist, but he's not a good email answerer. So I'm waiting for stuff to get back.
Well, look, they didn't have email in the Middle Ages.
That's it. That's why. Right. He went to PIM, so it's like they trained them to be. Period. So I'm here waiting, for responses, and I'm teaching kind of a round of courses, and I was a great program. I loved it. I drove actually 2 hours to Frederick, Maryland, 1 day a week, to teach like these big block classes for Mount St. Mary's. So I'm doing that, and otherwise I'm just floating around. I was going to like a coffee shop and doing research while my wife was working. We didn't need the money per se, so I was like, I got to do something with myself until I defend my dissertation and figure out what in the world I even want to do with myself after graduate school. I mean, that's a different story. But I picked up actually, and we're going to talk about this next week, so I don't feel like I'm hawking it. It's actually my first translation by him. Always Be Merciful. It's my first full book length. His sense of mystery. I picked up the book and I was like, well, that's fascinating. I do remember Maritain citing that on a couple of occasions. Why that never make it into English? And it's a great text because it actually puts the lie to Garrigou being a hard-headed neo-scholastic who doesn't like mystery. Right. He wrote a book on the sense of mystery. And it's not maybe what someone would think, with the cup of tea for someone who's not a Thomist. But I did the translation for that. And it's, forever to the kindness of Scott Hahn that, cutting your teeth as a translator is hard, right? Like the trade has been something I've learned somewhat along the way with a couple scrapes. But they have at Emmaus Academic, actually, for them being a small and relatively new press, they grew out of Emmaus Road. They have a great process, though, a great translation review process, an excellent copy editing process. The copy editor I've worked with for them is just wonderful. So it really actually helped me kind of cut my teeth over there. And then at the same time, I was just like, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm still barely getting emails back from Timothy. I finished up a draft of The Sense of Mystery. This is years ago. I got them to do a contract for Sens Commune and The Order of Things. And then we hit a wall with rights in France. It just took forever to deal with the rights issues. And we finally did, and we worked out all the contracts and everything. But it just took a long time. And that's probably for the best, because I then I picked up some other projects. And in the course of that, you can't, unless, as long as you're really working at it, you really get a lot better translation wise. So the experience enabled me to come back to the draft translation of this guy and then fix it up with everything that I've learned since then. I mean, it's dedicated to John Dealey, because I was finishing this in 2017. When John Dealey died. I happened, by the strange providence, to be at Dr. Dealey's bedside when he died, just by the oddities of life for him. And he was not from up here, but ended up here in Western PA. And then luckily there was a good bit of time that intervened. It just sat. The file sat. And for a while I despaired and thought this stuff's not going to go anywhere because the French won't give me rights. So I picked up. I was like, well, who else is going to do it? And at the time, I didn't really have big plans to be in academia. And now I teach in the smallest of the Eastern churches. So I'm not burning. Whereas someone who's trying to get tenure, unless you're at like a really conservative college, doing Garrigou,
it's starting to. I'm hearing really bad feedback and buzzing. I don't know. Are y'all able to let me know in the chat if y'all hear that? I need to know if that's on my end or everybody.
Yeah, I can put headphones on.
Y'all let me know there in the live
Hold
chat.
on, I'm gonna turn my mute on. Let me hit mute.
Yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah, it sounded like bad echo and distortion all of a sudden. But again, I don't know. Sometimes might be just on my end, but then at other times it's something everybody. Yeah, no problem.
That's always a little weird. But can you hear me?
I can. And okay, yeah, everybody else was hearing it too. Okay, good. I was just making sure it wasn't on my end.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and figure out how to get only one on here, because I like to hear a little bit.
Yeah, right. So anyway, that's why I just got these little headphone earbuds.
Yeah, I know. These are nice. These are old. I had these for a long time. They're nice Sennheiser.
Those look like the ones you put on the old school Walkmans, right?
No, they're nice and Sennheiser, man. I can listen to Bach on these. It's wonderful.
Okay.
Bach or Mac Wiseman, either. So anyway, that's the story of all that stuff. It was an accident, really. That's what it is. And I'm not going to be on some, I'm not going to get doxxed by my fellow faculty at some, typical Catholic college or something where, you'd be, this would get you in trouble because someone who's heterodox doesn't want you to be doing this.
Right.
And Father Christian's fine with me doing it in an Eastern place.
Well, I'm glad he is, because I really think that we need more of Father Garrigou translated, because I mean, we often do get that impression that he was one of those stuffy manualists, and I appreciate the fact that you're combating that stereotype that isn't true. Now, can you tell us about the book overall, first of all? Kind of give us a summary. What exactly is this about?
So the book itself is about, it's dedicated to the principle of finality. That's actually the original French, the realism of the principle of finality. That's the French title. The Order of Things is just our English trying to make it sound nicer. among the various first principles that are involved in Thomist metaphysics, one of them is every agent acts for an end. It's tied up with the Aristotelian notion of teleology, the idea that there are final causes, that things act for the sake of some intelligible reason, some raison d'etre, some ultimate end in their action, as well as ultimately some subordinated end that places them within the universe. Yeah. People tend to think that this was overthrown by modern science, but there really are ways to incorporate teleology into a modern scientific framework if you're not materialistic like modern science tends to be. So the volume is divided into a sort of introduction to the principle of finality, and then applications to the principle of finality, which the real secret is they're essays he wrote that were related to it, and he put them together. And I tend to think, Dr. John Kerwin wrote the introduction for this volume for me kindly. He remarks about it being a unified whole because he wants to combat that idea. But as the translator, I get some ability to say, it's a little bit put together. But there are interesting applications, how this principle applies in knowledge, in the ordering of our will to God, and how you can prove God's existence through that ordering. So, I mean, it is related to the idea of agents acting for ends.
Is that because our will, the object of our will, is always good, and if there's a good, there has to be a highest good? Is that basically the argument?
That's basically how the argument ends up running. It hinges on the idea of the good being in things, in contrast to the transcendental truth. But basically, he says it's either absolute absurdity, or you can understand that freedom presupposes that God exists. So he develops that argument. And then, actually, the best essay metaphysically in the entire volume, though, is the last chapter on the reciprocal influence of causes, how the efficient cause, the agent, the doer cause, the description of an event about who did it, always is correlative to the final cause, and how those play off of each other, and then how formal causality and material causality play off each other. But there's some great stuff in that chapter above all, actually, that really shows the synthetic richness of traditional Thomism. So, excellent. So it's general and applied is sort of how it's set up.
And that was going to be one of my questions, if you could define that for us. Now, the other question that I had is, he talks about the primacy of being over becoming. What is that about?
Yeah, so the way he works out talking about the principle of finality is actually by putting the building blocks of Aristotelian metaphysics on the table in the text. Now, he's writing in the 20s and 30s. In a French context that had been, even in Catholic circles, very much vitalist. The philosophy of Henri Bergson was very influential. It was a kind of, among other things, evolutionist philosophy, in the sense that all of reality is nothing more than evolution. And we happen to have concepts that cut reality up, but becoming, change, alteration, you can get a big swollen voice, dynamism is the primordial reality, not being. Being is, you'll see people who write like this throughout the period. Static Greekness is what being is. That's a static look on the world. And he's basically combating that and saying, no. Being on the Aristotelian account is act. I mean, especially existence, but he's not doing sort of what people do later in the literature with all the other bits of Aristotelian and Thomist metaphysics. He just wants to give an outline of, well, why is it that you can't even understand becoming without having an account of being, the principle of non-contradiction, and other principles in metaphysics. And he does it in a set of dialogues.
Well, I forget which philosopher it was. I think one of the Ionian philosophers who would argue that everything is always in a state of flux. Is that kind of what he's combating?
And he does it explicitly. He sets it up like a dialogue right there of Heraclitus.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right, so he sets it up where the dialogue opens up with Heraclitus and Parmenides having their battle, because Parmenides says, he has a sort of intuition. I use this word is. That which is, because is is, right? Like just be
there's
really
no change.
exactly. Because there the idea of non-being is just an absolute non-being, and is just is. So everything we experience must be some phenomenal haze of deception, whereas the way of truth is to acknowledge that there is no change, that being is. That's it. And Heraclitus is played off of him. They're not in any kind of direct dialogue, but they're eventually put into dialogue by Aristotle. And so Garrigou then, instead of doing it in the more semi-pedantic way that you would do in the physics and the metaphysics, he does it as a dialogue between them.
What wasn't it the case that Aristotle in his metaphysics, he basically notes that the difference between act and potency is really what explains those two tensions.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, technically, that's going to come to play in book 3 of the physics, as well as then later on in theta in the metaphysics as well. The big metaphysical account of act potency is theta in the metaphysics. But when he talks about motion in the physics, he already starts talking about act and potency as well, because you can't really explain what motion is unless you see it as a kind of imperfect act. But yeah, the division of being into act and potency helps to explain how something can pass from not being something to being it, because as long as it has the capacity for becoming what it's going to become. So I go from being, non-virtuous to virtuous, or I go from being temperate to maybe not non-sober, but it's only one beer.
Before somebody accuses you.
Exactly. I have the capacity for sobriety, right? And so you can, in the virtue sense, not just a disposition sense. And so, because that's within my capacities, I am not that, but I am it in potency. Potency is very strange because it's a kind of non-being that is. Because I'm not, whatever, or I'm not walking right now, but I can. And when I do, in that case, I'm just the cause. I'm the cause of that in a different perspective. But let's not get into the nuts and bolts of it. The idea is just to basically use that. Let me back up and use the typical idea that people cite from Aristotle, but it's actually about art. But they say, the block of marble is in potency to becoming a statue. That's the normal thing to do because it's easier to see. So Aristotle uses that easier thing. It's much harder to explain natural teleology, natural causality, but the block of marble can become a statue. And if you see that, you've got potency and act that's going on there. You also have matter and form, because the form is the intelligible structure of the statue. So you can start to talk about the four causes. The sculptor makes it for the end of making a statue. At least in the art activity itself, whatever his ulterior ends might be. So that same kind of reasoning can be applied to all beings, and that's what this book is arguing. But it opens up with a basic grammar through dialogue of how that arises. It's interesting. I mean, it develops out of Plato. If you ever read the Sophist is an example of Plato saying, the forms intermingle. And so he does that. He actually, goes through some of that metaphysical stuff from Plato and then develops it down an Aristotelian way. And it's done in a very accessible manner.
Well, that was going to be one of the questions that I was right about to ask, and then I have another one. Okay. Is it the case that you just have to be an expert in Aristotle to really follow what he's saying here? Or no, you don't have to have that kind of foundation?
No, I don't think. I think especially for the first half, you don't need to be at all. I mean, you have to have a little bit of philosophical chops, right? I mean, it's it's philosophy, but it's done as a dialogue at the beginning, and then the bit on the nature of the principle of finality, like based on those first 2 chapters, you should have enough to then be able to digest the rest. Some of the later chapters are a bit technical, so but even in there are a couple, like chapter 4, chapter 6. Those are pretty, and chapter 5 as well are pretty accessible, and also that one on miracles. So yeah,
I love the authors who write in the form of dialogues. I think it is the best way to really communicate things. I always see that as the best way to do things, is just put it in a dialogue fashion.
That's funny. I mean, like, I like this kind of dialogue where it's direct. Right? I mean, the great literary dialogues are like Plato's style, right? Like when you compare Garrigou's dialogues or Augustine to Plato, you know, both Garrigou and Augustine have a little bit of that dialogue style of like, set it up, hit it down, set it up, hit it down, right? Whereas Plato's so much more like nuanced. And I mean, the Plato scholars love that stuff because you have to really work through the idea and see what he's doing. Scholastic in me is like always a little bit like, get to the damn point.
Yeah, his dialogues are a little bit harder to engage compared to some, but I mean,
but they're great. I mean, they're wonderful. I don't want
no, absolutely. But I mean, you look at some like the dialogue with Palamas and Barlam and others like that. I mean, they're a little bit easier to read.
Yeah.
So I've always appreciated that than just some kind of theological treatise. Not that those don't have their place and their utility, but they do. I'm just saying, for the average person, I think they're going to be able to relate more to a dialogue than anything else.
No, and for students as well. I mean, I actually, even now, when I teach Aristotle, it's usually the end of Aristotelian metaphysics, because we just have this little short sequence of courses we do. So I just use these first 2 chapters.
Yeah.
Right, because that's the easiest thing for my students to digest. They're not in a place to really be able to digest the metaphysics, and that's fine. And it's just, you know what I mean. It's realistic. I want them to leave with some knowledge and not panic.
Well, speaking of realistic and metaphysics, let's talk about realism. Now, because you have in the subtitle, and of course he's talking about it in the book, the realism of the principle of finality. We discussed the principle of finality, but for those who are not familiar with realism, what exactly is it?
So a lot of the debates, or a lot of discussions after Aeterne Patris, the encyclical by Leo XIII, that brought about scholastic renewal, were centered on, among other things, but pretty heavily, the problem of knowledge, because the modern world had bequeathed the problem of how do we actually know anything that's in the world. So that kind of epistemological problem, that problem in the order of the theory of knowledge, was somewhat consuming even for the scholastic, the so-called neo-scholastic period after that. Rightly so, though, because talk to anyone who's taken a philosophy course and no one thinks they know anything, right? That it's all a bit of mirage somewhat. So in this case, you know, he approaches in the first half, he just wants to say this is proven to be a metaphysical principle and not merely some law of our mind that structures our mind. That the idea that every agent acts for an end, that teleology exists in nature itself, is a metaphysical reality, not merely something that's logical or, you know, in the end subjective. How, you know, I always am a little intrigued of how he makes the idea of the realism of it. When he talks about the idea of the will and its ordination to the good, he applies it in a way to show that the will has to, by its own structure, either be totally incoherent or have a sort of foundational realism grounded in our desire for really the objective infinite good that is God, in order to account for freedom. Now, when it comes to some of these earlier chapters on the, you know, finality and the intellect and our intellectual knowledge and realism, he basically wants to I think implicitly make the argument that our intellect is able to know not only its immediate object of knowledge, which actually starts in the domain of essences of sensible things, but ultimately being is its object, its adequate object. But it not only knows its object, it also knows that reflectively, if we perform a careful critique of our knowledge, we can know that the intellect itself is essentially by its nature relative to being. I mean, that's just built into the idea of reflectively coming to know that the object of our intellect is being. And so it has an inherent realism that's directed to extramental reality. Now, that's not the same thing as proving our senses are veracious. That's a different issue that he deals with elsewhere. But ultimately, at least the fact that extramental reality, whether it's existing or not existing, is what our intellect is directed to, is something we can reflect on by seeing that our activity of intellection has a finality that's grounded in being. So I think that's where he's getting the realism bit to put in there to connect it, is that ultimately the principle of finality, along with the affirmation that being is of primary importance, not only in the order of cognition, but metaphysics, together help undergird the Thomist synthesis regarding realism and our ability to actually know reality and not merely sort of fabricate our way around reality so that we can practically survive, because that's your other option.
Mm. You know, you did talk about the dependability there for our senses. You said he engages that elsewhere. Does he engage that here or just in different essays?
I don't think it's in here. I mean, the way I'd be able to tell is if I had an easy entry for a citation to he has an essay I put in, a volume I did with Clooney Press, Philosophizing in Faith, where he does engage a bit with that. But actually, the Thomist position is we're intellectually more certain about the principle of non-contradiction. One and the same thing can't be and not be at the same time in the same respect. And you have to really carefully critique the idea that the senses are essentially relative to existentially present being. That the sensation of something not present is internally contradictory. Now you have to develop that a bit to deal with the organs of sensation and the brain better than the scholastics do. But that's effectively the point is that argument is actually pretty late in your epistemology, because your first evidence for the Thomists and for Aristotle too is the principle of non-contradiction. So that's a very standard thing. Yeah. In Garrigou, that is. Yeah.
Right. Now, he talks about the sense knowledge being described as a mystery. Can you maybe explain that for us? How is it that sense knowledge is mysterious?
Yeah. Well, think about what sensation is. When you go from even just thinking of putting your hand on your hot coffee and your hand is being warmed.
Yeah.
So being warmed, how to put it, becoming warm.
Yeah.
As opposed to being in contact through sensation with that which is warm and is other than you. There are two kinds of reception going on there. There's a subjective, as the scholastics later called it, physical reception, that is you're warming. Your hand is just warming. But you also have a cognitive awareness, even at the lowest level of like an oyster or wherever sensation starts. Sensation is the reception of the other as other. It's a form of knowledge. Even in its most base. Yeah, I mean, you're receiving the other as other. It's clearer in intellectual knowledge than going way down into sensation, because sensation is so indescript. My relationship to you is a kind of becoming. I mean, not even just you. When I think of human nature that we share together, or whenever I think of a virtue, that's a good example. You can think many things about the virtues and talk about them without ever being virtuous, without having the form of the virtue in your soul. But you can be united to it as a kind of cognitive other. And that was by the later school called the objective reception of forms. So there's a different sort of reception of the intrinsic intelligibility of something between whenever it's received subjectively or as a form that informs me, as opposed to when I know it. I'm actually in touch with it as something other. And that's just very mysterious. It's hard to explain. Like, you have to actually talk about the different ways forms are received, and you have to engage a very careful analogy of the way forms are received.
Let me make sure I'm following.
Sure, it's very really technical.
Yeah, I touched the hot coffee, so I'm aware of the form of coffiness there outside of me.
Yeah, but no, even that, your sensation of touch is just going to be that immediate sensation of the tactility of it, right? Your actual formation of knowing that it's coffee is going to engage a lot of the internal senses. So that's much more structured. But your hand becoming warm, being aware of warmth.
Yeah, so there's two things. I'm aware of my hand being warm when it comes in contact with that hot coffee.
Yes.
And I'm also aware that there's a hot coffee out there outside of me.
No. Your hand, no. So imagine you don't feel it, that you're sensory deprived.
Okay.
Your hand still becomes warm. You just don't feel it. Right. Yeah. It's the caloric state of the hand is heated up.
Okay.
Now imagine that you get your sense of touch back. At once in sensation, and it's a very mysterious combination of the two kinds of reception of form. In sensation, you are receiving the form both as warming and having whatever set of chemical reactions throughout your entire system, right? Everything up through the, Pacinium corpuscle, well, maybe Pacinium corpuscle, but whatever neuron type is dealing with the heating there. All of that physicality is one thing. And it's a kind of, it's an intelligible set of interactions that can be studied in chemistry or in biology. But then also the phenomenon of the sensation of heat and touch is not fully reducible to that. It's not merely just atoms hitting off atoms, right?
How do we know that it's more than that?
Yeah, well, this is where, I wasn't preparing tonight to do a full, it's a hard topic, right? Because this is, well, first of all, to acknowledge the fact that it is really hard. This is why he calls it a mystery, because it's very hard to talk about these two different kinds of reception. And it's so liminal, its sense. But the phenomenon of, let's think about it. Sensing the coffee as a whole. So actually sensing a particular cup of coffee as a cup of coffee and seeing it as present, that is, ultimately what you're describing is a relationship that you have with a cup of coffee that's not reducible to any language of just the physical interactions.
Okay.
Right? Because you can desire it when it's not present, for instance. Yeah. You can be related to that thing when it's not present.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's different than the immediate physical interactions. And so that's two different, the scholastics explain that as two different ways of receiving form, what they call subjective and objective. I wasn't preparing for it.
No, but that's a good answer.
I'm going to note that external senses are not they're not the best place to start. I should not have started there. I was trying to go with the most basic, but that's proof of actually, it's very mysterious and difficult. Yves Simon did his dissertation on, and he was influenced by Garrigou-Lagrange, did his dissertation on human knowledge. And at the same time, he wrote a couple of articles on sensation, because it's very difficult to handle that parallel between how do you have a knowledge component and a physical component very deeply interacting because of the nature of our sense organs. Like you have, and explaining that's really the whole crux of trying to deal with the problem of sensation issue. And I see no way forward but to use those developments, like what you see in Simone. You can't, it's in Thomas's text, but it's, you need to really develop it against the rest of the later school. But it's a mystery. Is that, it's the kind of thing that you go from being a plant to being sensing. There's a qualitative jump there. And it actually is only the type of life that's expressing itself in those two cases are only analogically the same. They're more different than they are the same.
So another example.
Life. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's just another example of where the Thomist isn't saying, they know everything, but is open to the idea of mystery.
Yeah, that it's, that it is something that like you won't resolve with complete clarity, to be honest. And you need to figure a way out to do that without waving your hands. Because if you try to be too clear, you probably will end up a materialist, is what I would say, or a spiritualist, one of the two. You'll go down to a monism.
All right. Yeah. Now, shifting gears a little bit, he talks about the doctrine of the analogy of being. We always hear about the Thomist doctrine of the analogy of being, but could you maybe explain what exactly is it and what is his take on it?
Yeah, so this is in the text on knowledge, and it's in part on the way that, it's the march of our intellect through its experience, that as we really begin to grasp what the implications are of being, even between the idea that I'm a substantial whole and that I have certain qualities of soul that are dependent on me, like my intellect, my will, the various virtues that I have, the being of a quality is dependent upon substance in a way that substance is just far more independent, even though substance is still, we're still as individual substances dependent for our existence on some first cause. That's a different set of arguments that get you into the discussion of proofs of God's existence. But you slowly begin to realize in the kind of Aristotelian outlook that you can't treat being as a sort of genus, right? It's not as though all of my concepts basically march me up to a supreme genus that's being, which is differentiated into substance and accident. Because it's a bit much for one night to do, so I apologize if I feel like I'm skipping stones over water a bit. But you need a specific difference that's going to somehow be not tied into being. So let's think of our case, the classical case of rational animal that's used for man. Rational is something that's not kind of attached to animality, right? So I'm not circularly defining man by saying, that I'm a kind of, I don't know, ape animal with mind. I don't even know how to do it because it would be so goofy to try and define man in terms of some difference that would be, I'm an animal that's a thinking animal. So like I'm a thinking animal, that would be a circular definition. Now that's so stupid that we see it. But being, if it's the ultimate principle in your metaphysical synthesis, at least, cannot be divided against itself, because the only thing outside of being is non-being. And so your only difference that you would have would be non-being to apply to that. So for that reason, Aristotle says it can't be a genus. It's just said in different ways of different entities. So there are different classes of entity that, we cut the environment up into. Now, classically in Aristotle, that's the 10 categories. That needs to be expanded a bit, I think, but that's my soapbox. It's not Garrigou. The Thomist school begins to settle around the time of Thomas de Vio-Cajetan on emphasizing the fact that the formal notion, or the ratio, the definition, but it's not a definition, the formal character of being in each of those cases, substance, quality, quantity, is different, and they're proportionally the same. Being is said of substance in one way, it's said of quality in a different way, it's said of quantity in a different way. Quantity is, the first accident that arises from a substance because of its matter. A substance exists in itself. A quality exists on account of what something is formally in that thing. A relation is the adaptation of a substance to something else because of some ground. So paternity, because I exercised a certain kind of causality once upon a time. We all know how. I have children. That's each of the types of being are different. In the case of relation, the being of a relation is the towardness that is implied for the substance that is related. Towardness is the being of relation. Inness is a way we could call the being of substance. But the way that that's put by Cardinal Cajetan is these are like little proportions. Being is said of substance in its own way, as just as being is said in a different way of quantity or quality. Let me give you a different example. An artifact, this is going beyond what Garrigou would say, but it's, I think, based on Thomist principles. An artifact like the statue we talked about earlier has artificial being, just as we have natural being. Right, we're not, we have a preconceived, we're not created by anything other than perhaps, the first cause. But artificial being is dependent on our ingenuity. So it gets its structure from us. But the statue has an essence. I can define it. It's a kind of being, but being is said in two very different ways in this like doubly dependent being that is an artifact. And us, we're still a dependent being, but being is said really in a qualitatively different way between artificial being and natural being, is what it would be called. So that's the analogy of being, is the idea that you're actually applying a term that is used with multiple senses to multiple analogates. Now, this still has to be, developed, and John of St. Thomas does some development of it in his material logic. And that's what Garrigou inherits, is everything up to that content. And then the theologians within the Thomist school who use John of St. Thomas as well. So Billuart, Gonnet, and others. But it's basically John of St. Thomas's form. And then luckily, Yves Simone writes what I think. I always say this anytime I mention analogy, the best article ever on analogy. So, but that's a different issue. So the analogy of being is a way of talking about how certain terms, especially metaphysical terms like being, truth, oneness, have a pluriformity across their multiple occurrences, and it's not merely generic like a genus would be, where you define one thing and it applies to everything in exactly the same way. It's actually multiform, and then there are logical consequences of that have to be drawn. There's an order between them. Substance is the most case of being for Aristotle, at least. Technically a Thomist is going to have to push that a little bit, because Thomas he developed some stuff beyond Aristotle, but yeah. So this is all pretty technical. I can feel like, because I was in lecture mode on Wednesday night, and that's technical stuff too. But when you do philosophy and metaphysics, you're like, oh, people are going to glaze over when they hear this.
Well, I think this is one that they might find interesting. The question is raised in the book: does the natural desire for happiness prove the existence of God? That's a very practical question.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So there are two things, and he does answer it. Yes. And he considers what is. It's like, I don't like having both of these headphones on. What's presupposed or built into the idea of eudaimonism, or morality that's directed to flourishing and happiness, like that of Aristotle, is the underlying notion that our intellect, in order to have an appetite, a desire that matches it, that's different than an animal's desire for whatever in its environment that matches its particular essence. An intellectual desire ultimately must have the same breadth as the intellect. If the intellect can conceptualize all things within the latitude of being, its correlative desire, the will, as it comes to be called, especially in post-Augustinian theology, which is going to be taken up by Aquinas, of course, has as its, in the order of nature, setting aside questions of grace, because he's talking just philosophically here, latitude that is the good. Everything is desired intellectually under the species of being something that is good. And then technically that's what enables freedom. What enables freedom is the fact that many means, an infinite number of means, can be fit into that most primordial desire of the will. And so the defense of freedom for the Thomists actually is that our will is so hyper-tuned that no finite choice, no choice, short of the beatific vision, which is actually impossible for us to know, is even a possibility for us by nature alone, and in any case can't be achieved either by nature alone. Short of the beatific vision, every choice falls short for our will. So then he works through applying the idea of every agent acting for an end to this sort of fundamental datum about freedom, which he works out just a bit. I mean, it's brief because it's a profound issue, but he gives the skeleton of how if you do not hold that every agent acts for an end, your only other option here is going to be to say that freedom is effectively just a kind of absurdity without an ultimate raison d'etre, or without an ultimate some people would say sufficient reason, but the explanation that the tuning of our will to the full latitude of that which is good, which is an intellectual kind of desire, ultimately posits that there must be a subsistent good in which that can, and I'll finish, in which that good can be found. And I'll let you respond.
Well, if our will is in tune to this good, why is it that some people for all eternity choose this something other than this good in hell?
Yeah, well, so it's tuned. Yeah, it's tuned to be chosen still as something we have to elicit. That's what makes it a free choice, right? Is the fact that it's the kind of choice we determine for ourselves. And so you can determine to set that good in anything. You can set it in yourself, for instance. Now, listen, the proof rests on this idea that the good exists in things, whereas, for instance, truth exists in the intellect. I do find the proof a teeny bit fast. It moves quickly. So basically, the will is tuned to the full latitude of good. The good exists in things, and not merely as like something that we come up with and think of. Therefore, there either has to be a supreme good that in which this full desire of our will is found, or otherwise the only other option is radical absurdity. One of the people who wrote comment for my book, Tom Osborne, said that he thinks this is the best proof for the existence of God based on the natural desire of our will. I think it's a proof that's like fitting, but it's not. I find it to be lacking a teeny bit. Now he has in the back of his mind this series of articles that Ambrose Gardet wrote, and so I don't know if he's seeing his proof kind of illuminated by like these 8 articles that Ambrose wrote, that Gardet wrote. You know what I mean? And that's like making him more certain of the proof structure that he presents. But it hinges really heavily on the idea that it's basically not a velleity, that we're not coming up with a good that we imagine but can't be achieved. So, but the idea would be that our nature itself would have built into it, like, because we are saying that will has a nature that is tuned to the good. You would be saying that it's tuned to something that's a non-existent and non-achievable end. So its finality is directed towards something that's non-achievable, and you'd find yourself in a kind of existentialism position. You're going to strive after the good, even though it may never be achievable, right? That you're trying to give meaning to a life that's fundamentally absurd.
Sorry. Now my other question here is, and by the way, I just put in the chat, y'all go ahead and send your chat questions. Make sure to send it to @Reason in Theology. So one final question here. He talks about towards the end, the knowability of miracles. Can you maybe comment on that? He talks about the finality and natural knowability of miracles. So if there's a natural knowability of miracles, does that mean that, hey, I can just go and prove, hey, there was this miracle, therefore God, and you can know this naturally?
Yeah, well, okay, so he's a couple things there, because the proof is actually probably already dependent on some acceptance of the existence of God, because a miracle is going to have to be known as being only causable by God, as a supernatural cause. What he's really concerned with in this essay, which is actually quite important in apologetics, is a debate that he got engaged in over whether or not you need faith to discern miracles. Necessarily. Now, we're not saying whether or not faith can help you discern miracles, whether even faith helps most people discern miracles, because our intellect has been darkened. He's asking, sort of metaphysically speaking, is it absolutely necessary that one must have supernatural faith in order to discern a miracle? He holds, go ahead.
Well, wouldn't Vatican I kind of be opposed to that when it says that it basically condemns the idea? Yeah.
You just came to me, right? That's exactly what his approach is that in order for there to be evident credibility of miracles, that reason can have a proof offered for religion by, an effect that could only be caused by a supernatural cause. In order to have that affirmation of Vatican I hold, you'd say that, miracles are ultimately provable as they're not supernatural in themselves.
Sure.
Because they're effects that are natural done by a supernatural cause. But that you can see this supernatural causality active in the miracle. But there was a debate that had opened up because of a couple of Jesuit interlocutors where he detected the idea, that the assertion was being made too strongly, that a miracle in the end could only be understood qua miracle by faith. By doing that, it would seem to his eyes overturn everything that was said not only at Vatican I, but in the anti-modernist oath that's required, in Pascendi that's pushed back on as well, that miracles are something that can be known by natural reason alone. Natural reason can know that God exists, can know technically that he's supernatural in his essence. That's the one supernatural truth we can know. It's just that we don't know it. We know that we don't know it because we know there must be a supernatural first truth that is God, that he knows, but that we don't know. And that supernatural entity that is God, I mean, it's very distant and Aristotelian feeling, but God, who is the first cause who's supernatural, has an efficacy that far outstrips anything that would be possible in the finite order. And so he would be the only one who could affect this miracle. So that proof is at least de jure able to be run. And that's what that's about. And then he sticks on the front of it that it's about the finality of those miracles, because those miracles can, of course, be directed toward rational credibility, which is needed for the assent of faith, at least objectively, because faith is something higher than rational credibility, but it's presupposed by faith. So he says because of that structure of being necessary, that there's a finality there. So he can take this essay that he's written and put it in this book. So it's interesting. There's some interesting stuff in the footnotes in that text, though, because there's a little bit of bickering and banter between the Jesuits going on in there. So Vladimir Ledikowski, that's where I came off that one time, and you asked me something. There's a footnote in here with Vladimir Ledikowski's text that it's just interesting to watch the wiggling of Jesuits trying to get out of the 24 Theses. So.
This one is from Henry. Dr. Miner, what are your thoughts on the use of St. Thomas's works in the late Byzantine context of the lights of Demetrios and Condones? I know it's not very related here to our discussion.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, it is, historically all that stuff, and Marcus Plested's trying to really develop, a comfort with that. His Orthodox readings of Aquinas, for instance, has at least a good overview. Clearly, in that 14th and 15th century context, you have a deep willingness. I mean, even in someone like Gennadius Scholarius, to interact deeply with Thomas. Gennadius was usually called a Byzantine Thomist. That's not the case. He was very kind to Thomas, though, and I think it's unfortunate that a certain kind of, I'm just really watching my words. I'm saying, I feel I can say these words because Plested says them. A certain sort of insecurity about talking to Thomas without slamming your fist on the ground and shouting rationalist settled in. And Plested says one of his goals is to try to encourage, the Orthodox world to feel that, you can be confident enough to dialogue with Aquinas, because Aquinas is inheriting so much of the Greek, the Greek Hellenistic world. This is, one of the things that I think Scholarius says, you were just born in the wrong place. You were a Greek in soul, and you only have the filioque, and I forget one other thing. That's your errors.
The papacy,
the papacy. Yeah.
I remember that. All right. This one is from Brady. Does Garrigou talk about frantic miracles that mimic true miracles, which could explain why the Eastern Orthodox saints have incorruptible bodies sometimes?
That's two things.
Yeah, right.
Two things in one. He does talk about the appearance of miracles, and that's more like in De Revelatione, though, actually. And it's been a while since I've reread that section, because it's the last thing I have to edit. My recollection is it's a tiny bit fast. He tends to think there will be some external means to be able to tell that it's a false miracle effectively. And it's a bit quick, actually. I do find it a little bit not naive. Yeah, naive is the way to put it. Now, could be, of course, the saints in the Orthodox Church, could well be in a state of grace with the sacraments that they have, and they could be incorrupt. So I tend toward that end on that, because I'm, I guess, just the uniate in my soul, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I
just hope that those are probably real miracles for real saints, actually. So.
I don't have a problem with incorruptible Eastern Orthodox saints.
Yeah.
All right. So, Dr. DeCluve asks, I often hear people critique Heidegger for obsessing about being. This leaves me scratching my head as someone trained under your Thomistic professor, Monsignor Whipple. What gives? I'm not saying Heidegger is good, but I understand the critique of the question.
Yeah, I just need Richard, if you're around, Heidegger is horribly haunted by the question of being, I think that John Deely, if you can find John Deely's dissertation that he wrote under the Dominicans, he has this very convincing layout of how, it creeps into Heidegger from his interaction with the modus logic that they thought was Scotus, because that's what he wrote one of his dissertations on. That he very early on is playing around with the scholastics talked about as intentional being, and he has a rich idea of intentional being moral, our moral existence, our historical existence, our artistic existence. And then he's aware of this way that traditional philosophy kind of slurs together, ontological being with that domain and that latitude of experienced being. Beyond that, I never even did Heidegger. I'll be honest, I avoided Heidegger in grad school, even though we had, near the end of my time, a Heideggerian scholar. I've just read his preface to Metaphysics. I have a guy who was my best man, a friend of mine, who thinks so highly of Heidegger, and he's a scholastic of the same stripe as me as well. And I think he was haunted by trying to articulate intentional being and the being as experienced by man. And he knew enough scholasticism from his original upbringing that there's this reactiveness that leads to his prose, which I just find his prose to be a obscurantist for no reason. And I have a real hard time with spending time on something that's that obscurantist. I only have so long to live, and now as a family man, I have less hours. So there is a kind of obsession, right? They say he was around writing about hammers till his last days because he was worried about the being of a hammer. I find that problem to be actually quite interesting. I find it to be actually an example of something the scholastics are blind about, because they repeat Aquinas over and over again, and they don't see that kind of problem in intentional existence. But if you're interested in it, you want to then eventually dig, far more than I think I'm willing to. That the dissertation, Heidegger, I forget what it is, even the title of it. It's Heidegger and Something by John Dealey, is what I would recommend for an interesting interaction from a scholastic point of view. He wrote that while he was still, I think, a Dominican. Actually, right before orders, he left the Dominicans before becoming a deacon.
And that was his dissertation.
Yeah, it's very good. Actually, he was brilliant. He's quirky as all get out, but he was brilliant.
Now, this one is from Patrick. Dr. Minard, is this book also about Garrigou's writings on sanctifying grace?
No, not particularly, although I'm kind of curious because of that last chapter, if there's something comes up. So, well, I don't have anything even in my index on grace. There's not a ton in here on grace. If it's said, it's in passing. And it would only be in, maybe there's bits about the analysis, the act of faith in that last chapter. So, sorrowfully, no, sorry. It's a dear theme for me because, of course, it's so close to home with themes of theosis and divinization and the things I teach in moral theology.
I only see one more in the chat, but it's not exactly on topic. If y'all have any others, go ahead and send them now. Otherwise, I think that'll do it. I tried to also put a link there while we're live to Emmaus Academic for the book, but it wasn't saving. So I'm going to do that after the show posts, so y'all can go and check it out. But for now, what you could do is just type in Emmaus Academic, and you'll see it come up. Now, I think there is one more on here.
Sure.
In his reality book, Garrigou mentions that Descartes' cogito cannot be the first thing that we know. He points to non-contradiction, since I think therefore I am too. Why?
Yeah, so this is a line he's running actually out of, I think it's John Baptiste Gonet. No, it doesn't matter who it's out of. Now the problem is okay, let me not get caught on that. He's running this out of a classic Thomist response to Descartes that goes back to pretty close to the time of Descartes' life. And first of all, Aristotle really means what he means in the fourth book of the Metaphysics about the principle of non-contradiction, but let's not argue based on authority. That the cogito, as used as a term, and this is how Aristotle argues, if you use the term cogito, you're distinguishing it from the non-cogito. Right? Because otherwise, if your terms don't have any meaning whatsoever, you're not going to be able to form any statements at all. So implied in your use of any term, cogito, thinking subject, I, however you want to put that, you're already implying the principle of non-contradiction. because in order to have fixed signifying value, you're saying the cogito cannot be the cogito and not be the cogito. It can't be non-cogito at the same time, in the same respect. Already, even if you want to presume that the cogito is somewhere pretty close to the first proofs that we make, it can't be the first intuition that we have, the first proof, because it
already assumes the principle of non-contradiction.
Exactly. Now, that's not saying that it assumes that our senses are veracious and we know reality. It just assumes the evidence of the principle of non-contradiction.
Right. Which is not necessarily dependent on the senses.
Yeah, exactly. You have to go on.
It starts really in the senses, does it?
It does, but the defense of that is going to be later. That's all. Right. So like eventually you defend that fact. But I'm making the point that the very first evidence you have there, and it will have the implication of having arisen from experience, but in itself, you see in the intellect's ordering to being, its opposition, its immediate opposition to non-being, and that's already implied in the cogito. So that's in reality. In a couple of the essays in Philosophizing on Faith, actually, Philosophizing in Faith that I did with Clooney Press, he does that as well. It's a very classic line in the Thomist school after the time of Descartes. Trying to think now who it is, because I'm thinking of Jacques Casimir Garrigou, who keeps coming up to my mind between Gonnet and the person I'm thinking of, actually, I think. But he also says that Zigliara, who was the cardinal who was involved as a ghostwriter for Aeterni Patris, as basically making that same kind of argument. I think Roselli does, a couple of others. But it's a traditional thing. If you read Roger Ariou's book on the scholastics at the time of Descartes, I think he even cites it. So he is basing that not merely on a kind of neo-scholastic approach to the question, but actually on how the Thomists for a couple hundred years had approached Descartes.
So, in probably our last one here is from Gregory. Who influenced Garrigou more, Cajetan or John of St. Thomas?
John of St. Thomas through Charles René Billuart is what I would say. Cajetan is, where he makes his odd move, some of his odder moves, like in the Prima Pars regarding supernaturality. Garrigou is always very deferential to him. He basically gives as often as possible reverential reading. And at one point in the Sense of Mystery, he says something like, like the great masters occasionally press too hard on the key. Cajetan has done that here. But there are some things he takes right out of Cajetan as well. Like on Divine Simplicity, he's totally indebted to Cajetan. Hero monk Gregory, because I'm guessing that's who you are. I know that you have some opinions, I think, in your book on Cajetan and sacred doctrine about John of St. Thomas and the nature of sacred doctrine. I disagree violently with Congar about that. Generally, Garrigou reads, and I had to be very careful when I was reading your book, actually, because Garrigou inherits a reading of Cajetan that tends to just read him in direct continuity with John of St. Thomas on the nature of theology. They tend to just kindly read all that stuff as being relatively the same. So that's why I got nervous there, because I saw the name and I thought I had such a violent reaction to reading Charlier and Congar just a week ago in some footnotes. But I'm so glad that someone wrote a book that COA Press published on Cajetan on sacred doctrine. We live in a weird world where everything's falling apart in one way, but then your books like yours are being published. So, but I was trying to answer. I got worried because I was trying to answer, and I'm hoping that you're still watching. I was thinking, if I tell you that he's more John of St. Thomas, are you going to think that's bad? Because people like Congar make it sound like John of St. Thomas has set theology up to be nothing more than conclusion theology. And it makes me sad. But Garrigou's guide, because it's a pedagogical thing, they're all reading Billuart. So for your listeners, Billuart is the later commentator who's he writes like a shorter version on John of St. Thomas's Cursus Theologicus that's supposedly like updated for 18th century approaches to theology. So it's it's a little bit briefer than John of St. Thomas. It's more of a compendium. It's much more used, I think, pedagogically by the Dominicans after that period, and so that becomes the touch point very often for Garrigou.
If I understood you correctly, I didn't know anybody thought of John of St. Thomas as nothing more than, conclusion theologian, just because when I've read them in other areas, I haven't read them in these areas, but other areas on deposing a pope or something, he seems to have some good theories of his
Well,
own.
what was going on there? There's a distortion. It's a real distortion that I've critiqued in the pages of No Vetter, that the Thomists tend to turn theology into virtual revelation, which means it's primarily the scientific deductions that happen objectively, illatively. Look, I'm trying to avoid all this technical terminology. New conclusions outside the deposit of faith. It can sound like you start with faith, and even if you say that faith is involved in the reasoning of theology, you're kind of going outside the deposit of faith whenever you do theology. And there's stuff in their texts that read like that. There really is. I tend to think, that they're trying to acknowledge that theology does something with its principles, and hence it's a wisdom. It's like what we talked about on Wednesday, is what this is like, is what this is touching into. Because Garrigou saw that. Garrigou saw in John of St. Thomas and the later people that the bits that they said about theology as a form of wisdom needed to be developed outside of this kind of conclusion theology. Father de Lubac says, you people make it sound like theology marches from conclusion to conclusion to conclusion, and that's what it just does. But Garrigou's really clear about theology meditating on the principles of faith. And I don't know if he's getting that out of just out of reading Cajetan's commentary on the first question, the Summa. I think he's synthesizing the loose ends that are there in all of the tradition. And that's why I don't like the idea of Father, this vein out of Father Congar that would be against John of St. Thomas for that, because you're just cutting off all the commentators who have taught people who seemingly got over the very issue that Father Congar lamented. I sometimes think Father Congar said that because he hated his teachers and he wanted to find a way to cut his teachers off, but I'm being perhaps unfair.
If I'm following you accurately, please correct me if I'm not.
I'm in the weeds with a fellow scholar through you. So.
Well, it's, if I'm following you correctly, it's interesting just because we talk about some things. Can we do theology that is outside of the deposit of faith? If I'm following you correctly, that's kind of the question. And I don't have a problem with that as long as we're not saying this is binding on the faithful. I would just put that with primary and secondary objects. But I'm fine with some kind of tertiary object as long as it's not an object of infallibility.
And that was the critique of the Thomists, to be clear, was that they reduced it just to that, as though theology doesn't have something to do within the doctrine of faith as well, that it just becomes about the theological conclusions, right? So it would only be the kind of things that can't be defined, which is just phenomenologically incorrect, because theologians have helped in the definition of truths of faith. Right? The church takes them, and they, it's because the church then proposes them that they're then, we believe them because God has revealed them, but the church's proposition lies in the church's power. But she asks her theologians to help articulate certain truths. I mean, you see this like before the Assumption, right? You have an encyclical that's asking about that. So Father Congar is touching on something that is a historical malady that goes the whole way back to Aquinas, treating it like a science, and sciences are about conclusions in Aquinas and Aristotle. Go read my article. Go read. It's on my website, and it's also in Nova et Vetera. That will explain what's going on here. It's wisdom be attentive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't see the problem with theological conclusions of what Thomists are doing, because
there's not. It's if you reduce it just to that.
Oh, right.
Just to that, and that's a really legitimate critique.
Yeah.
But read in my article, I admit, like, a lot of Thomists talk like they do, though. A lot of Thomists talk like they do. That's the problem. Yeah, that is a real problem. And that's a real problem. Like, go read my article. It's 46 pages. I have 46 pages with 100 footnotes. Do you not think I take this seriously? But Hero Gregory, I mean this all very, very warmly. So it was just like I had just a flash moment. I thought, oh no, there's a growing consensus that John of St. Thomas is bad, and somehow Cajetan is the one who's good, and now Garrigou-Lagrange is going to get written off because of this.
Well, so this was fun, Dr. Minard. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your book. Again, for everybody, it is The Order of Things, the Realism of the Principle of Finality, of course, by Father Garrigou-Lagrange and translated by our very own Dr. Matthew Minard. Like I said, I'm going to put a link to this to Emmaus Academic Publishing as soon as this, finalizes and goes on YouTube. But in the meantime, just, go to Emmaus Academic, Google search, it'll come right back, come right up, I should say. Anyways, any concluding remarks that you wanted to make there, Dr. Minard?
No, I don't think. I mean, it's heady stuff. I mean, I'll just say that. I know that it's heady stuff, but it's very accessible, that first part. I mean, I think highly of the text, or I wouldn't have done it. And it's an act of a kind of filial appreciation for someone who has influenced my thought very, deeply, even though I have my own internal developments of the tomosynthesis. So,
and we have another book we're going to be talking about that you translated. Tell us a little bit about what we can look forward to there.
Yeah, so next week, it's just by happenstance because Emmaus got the text to them. This is not part of some ploy that we have put together for me to always be on all the time.
No.
But the sense of mystery, we'll talk about the sense of mystery next time. Clarity and obscurity in the intellectual life. It actually was The Intellectual Chiaroscuro is what the original title was, and hence the painting on the front. But they said that's not going to sell, so we're going to
call it. That would not sell at all. I'll tell you that right now.
But in French, chiaroscuro is clair-obscur, so it's brightness and darkness. So that's why we said clarity and obscurity.
But all of us English speakers would just say, what?
Yeah, or rednecks in the mountains in Appalachia. Right. We say it too. So
awesome. Okay. Well, I look forward to that, Dr. Minard. Again, that's going to be next Friday. Y'all check out the link that I'm about to post here in just a minute. Go support Dr. Minard by getting a copy, and also check out his Patreon account that I'm going to link as well. But again, thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Minard. Everybody, thank y'all for your participation there in the chat. Check us out at reasonoftheology.com if you would like to see some of our articles and lectures that we're putting together, and also patreon.com/reasonoftheology if you would like to support us. Till next time, God bless you all.